Now, it's important to note that the first time that polygamy was publicly announced for everyone to hear was in a church conference on the 29th of August, 1852 in Salt Lake. So 1852. Now, 10 years later, the 8th of July, 1862, Justin Morrill of Vermont introduced a bill into Congress called the Morrill Act, where this is the first bill that goes after polygamy. And people may not recognize this, but Abraham Lincoln was the president who signed that bill into law.
Yeah. And, you know, the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, as it's known, really didn't have any teeth behind it. And let's also say first, it's important to recognize, too, that Latter-day Saints didn't invent plural marriage. There's been research done by American history scholars that have shown that there were a bunch of different groups that were practicing plural marriage: Native American, African American, even some Catholic. And so this isn't just aiming at the Latter-day Saints, but we are the most prominent group.
And the most vocal about it. And the most open.
We're out west on our own. You have to recognize that at this time in American history, too, they're trying to colonize. When I say they, I mean Easterners, particularly Washington, D.C., politicians. They want to they want to westernize the West. And they kind of feel like, particularly those Latter-day Saints out west, there's a lot of mixing of church and state going on. They're out there on their own. We're not sure they're loyal to the federal government. We don't sure where they stand. We got to rein them in and get them under control. And so these bills start to pass partly because of all these tensions. But they can't really do anything about it originally because it's a civil war. You can pass laws, but if you don't enforce them, the laws mean almost nothing.
Yeah, so the penalty under the Morrill Act was $500 fine and imprisonment for a term of 5 years. But with the Civil War taking place back east...
And no federal officials to enforce it either.
They're not... That law is not being enforced.
Yeah.
So then you get the Edmunds Bill in 1882. So this is 20 years after the Morrill Bill.
Well, there were a handful of bills in between that tried to give the federal government, the Wade Bill, the Cragen Bill, the Cullums Bill in 1870. Those are all trying to say, okay, we passed this law. How do we help the federal government enforce it?
And then it really kicks into high gear.
It really kicks in with the Edmunds Act.
With the Edmunds Act.
Yeah.
And then 5 years later, 1887, Congress then passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which is, that is the big one. It disincorporated the church. It dissolved the Perpetual Immigration Fund, gave all of the property of the church to the government for the benefit of the common schools in Utah, and it took away the right of Utah women to vote.
Oh, and there were other huge things, too. And so process that really quick. One of the things you have to understand is the Edmunds-Tucker Act goes after the church specifically. It's not just a general anti-polygamy bill. They are going after, that bill goes after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It seizes any assets over $50,000. It also does not allow immigrants to come into America who are Latter-day Saints. So process that. We won't let you become a citizen of this country if you're a Latter-day Saint. In other words, we can't gather to Zion now. So Zion and gathering has now stopped because of this bill. They're going to seize control of our temples. They also have taken away women along, like we are the leaders along with Wyoming in the Suffrage Act of giving women the right to vote, and the Edmunds-Tucker Act revokes that right to vote. It makes people, it required any juror, voter, or official to swear an anti-polygamy oath. So not even if you were practicing polygamy, but if you even stated that you believed in it or that it should be legal, you were not allowed to act in those civil. I mean, there are so many thing after thing after thing. They could seize any asset from the church that they didn't feel was necessary for a religious purpose. They would jail polygamists for up to 5 years. It just, to cut to the chase, it wreaks havoc. It wreaks havoc on the church in terms of our temples. We're going to lose our temples, our ability to bind families together. We are going to lose our ability to create Zion and gather people to Zion.
We're going to lose all of our church leadership in prison, the First Presidency, Quorum of the 12,
Yeah.
all the leaders.
Yeah. And that's really what Wilford Woodruff is dealing with as a whole. And so, at the end of the day, the question is, well, what would you do? And ultimately, the question that Wilford Woodruff is saying is, what is essential to our church? Is polygamy our core essential doctrine?
Is it in our articles of faith even?
Yeah. And the very fact that Wilford Woodruff would be willing to take this question to the Lord, saying, can we get rid of plural marriage, shows that it should not and was not the defining doctrine of the church, even though they fought so stridently for it.
Yeah.
What Wilford Woodruff is taking to the Lord, in essence, is what's more important? Temples, mothers and fathers in their homes, to gather and build Zion, and to allow the leaders of the church to continue to operate, or to keep practicing polygamy? That was his question.
So those 1880s, those were rough years here in Utah and in parts of Arizona, parts of Idaho, rough years where there's lots of persecution coming against these families.
Oh yeah, these federal, I would invite everybody at home, make sure you read Saints Volume 2, these chapters, they're like the late 20s, early 30s chapters of Saints Volume 2, where you can get the detailed, wonderfully written stories of women and men going into hiding, women being forced to testify against their own husbands, people having to take assumed names, sons and daughters not knowing who their actual father was for fear of their dad being imprisoned. It was a terrible time. John Taylor, by the way, as president of the church, has to go into hiding. He gives his last public address in the Salt Lake Tabernacle as federal officials are waiting to arrest him after the address. And the church blocks the guards and everything, and they usher him out the back, and he's never seen in public again. Dies in hiding, and Wilford Woodruff will say he died because of the pressures of polygamy persecution.
It's very, very trying time for them.
So before we get to Wilford Woodruff and the actual declaration, it's really important, back to Article of Faith number 12 that we said we would touch on about honoring and obeying and sustaining the law. Our church deliberately went against the law at this time. There is a revelation in the Missouri period where the Lord says, when it comes concerning the laws of the land, I will that you obey whatsoever I say unto you. So it's not quite as black and white as we want to make it sometimes. And the church felt that these laws that were being passed were unjust. Now, while we were engaged in civil disobedience, protecting people's identity and putting people into hiding and things like that to practice plural marriage, the church also did, though, take the legal route. If we feel that laws are unjust, then we have recourse, particularly within the United States of America, in a democracy, to try to get laws changed. So the church did appeal the law, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1890, the Supreme Court upheld the Edmunds-Tucker Act, and that was the final blow.
Yep.
That's what kind of makes us go, we've pursued every avenue we can. What do we do?
So Tony had already mentioned this earlier, this idea of the government has made it very clear they will confiscate all of the possessions of the church, including the temples. We will lose our ability to do any temple work. So you can picture the prophet of God, Wilford Woodruff, with the weight of this situation on his shoulders, in the mantle that he's carrying, as he goes to God to say, what would thou have us do? If God tells us that we need to keep performing plural marriages, you know that he and the other leaders are going to defend that to their death, regardless of the cost.
Yeah.
They were willing to do whatever God wanted them to do. But I love the fact that he turns to he who stands at the head of this work to ask him what he would have us do.